Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of Beyond the Album Cover with yours truly, Jarrell Mason, where we get inside the entertainment industry with those in the know and give them their flowers while they're here to be celebrated. With me right now, I literally have the Doctor of Funk. Yes, he has an actual PhD from Cal Berkeley, author of many books, Funk, the music, people, and the rhythm of the one, and about the Black Panthers and how soul power revolutionized soul music, Black power revolutionized soul music, contributor of many books, and a master of all funk, like I said. So we're gonna get all that and then some with the one, the only Dr. Rickey Vincent, Mr. Vincent, Dr. Vincent, excuse me. Welcome to Beyond the Album Cover.
Thank you for having me here, Brother Mason, man. I'm just thrilled to be spitting about the funk, man. Not much you could do better than that, except
Yeah,
playing it and listening to it.
yes, sir. The whole funk and nothing but the funk.
That's right.
So let's go ahead and jump right into it. How did you end up at the prestigious Cal University at Berkeley?
Well, that kind of took a number of turns, but uh, you know how some of us, my generation, came up through the P-Funk, came up through the landing of the mothership, came up through Dr. Funkenstein, came up through the chocolate-coated freaking human habit form, and the way this guy could mix technical language with slang language in a way that just felt natural. It felt like that was the rhythm. Like you could uh, go into one and it doesn't take away from the other. And so I got into with a group of folks that were pretty much um, funky people studying math and science and things like that. And so I wound up in one of those Ronald Reagan recruitment programs. They were trying to get minority engineers. And so I snuck in the side door as an astronomy major. I said, okay, I can do some of that. I can do all those basics in math and science, but I want to go to other worlds. I want to go check out what is that on the top of the chocolate Milky Way and things like that. So I was already thinking in some kind of funkatized terms while I was trying to just get a degree and maybe be a science teacher or something. Be a high school science teacher. Came across a couple in my path, and I said, that's an honorable thing to do for a brother in the community. But the funk just kept pushing me forward, uh, and I did some more of that science work, and then found a internship in where was I in? Um, I was in Arizona at Kitt Peak Observatory. It's a big observatory way down there in southern Arizona, and I worked on the luminosity function of the galactic nucleus, and I just thought this is rocking. And I asked the people there, how do I get a job like this, like the rest of y'all? They said, well, 12 years of graduate school. I said, okay. Since I wasn't much older than that, I was like, no, okay, thank you very much. And I came back, and the following summer, I walked into the college radio station down there at Cal. Cal Berkeley had a radio station called KALX. And like a lot of radio, college radio, it was really free form. It was open, and you could do a lot of what you wanted to do. And they had their quirks, but they let you loose, really. And it was a punk rock station basically. And so I challenged their notions of how free punk rock really is by playing them Super Stupid and Alice in My Fantasies and some of these crazy funkadelic records, and then saying you can go further down, further deep. But it did kind of open me up to how bold one could be on the air with their music, because most of us are familiar with the jazz DJ over here, the smooth soul DJ over there. Most of us are familiar with maybe some artist or some historian that can present the music in a nice formal way. but college radio was where it was raw. It was happening wild, and that was really when hip hop was starting to go national, and that meant the first 12-inch singles of some of the first records. I mean, MC Light, I Crammed to Understand You. I mean, just Black Milk. I mean, crazy groups that were way underground, and we remember that period from, you know, Bust a Move and you know, Big Daddy Kane and some of those. But it was all kinds of music happening, all kinds of electronics, all kinds of experimentation, and I just kept sniffing out the funk. And then people started to approach me with, well, where'd that sample came from? I thought I heard that funk before. I was like, you don't know where that funk came before. You know, I tried to play it, got my own show, and so I started just doing what I thought was important. And y'all, I mean, people need to remember that when hip hop blew up, it was a statement of Black history to throw in a 70s funk jam that was forgotten or deliberately silenced. And then they bring it all the way back to the forefront. The first, of course, was with the James Brown tracks, but they were bringing back Lakeside and Fatback and Mass Production and Average White Band and Kool and the Gang, and then they started bringing back Zap and Parliament and you know, the big slapping funk from Dayton. So I wound up giving history lessons on the radio and telling people, okay, look, here's the rap tune, here's the sample, you know, here's the original song, boom, boom. And I was like, well, somebody needs to spell this out before somebody that doesn't know what the funk is going on starts to match these things up. And so we're talking about the middle 80s. There really wasn't an internet nationally. There wasn't any YouTube where you could just go and click and find out, you know, a song or a similar song and things like that. People had to still do a lot of hunting, a lot of similar to crate digging, where you find one record and you look for, you know, what's around it, or who else played on it and what did they do, and you start to learn about the music that way. So I started to spell it out, and by the middle 80s, it was like where I was, even though a whole lot of people were into the funk and P-Funk was coming to town and good heavy funk bands were still thriving in the 80s. They weren't getting on commercial radio, but they were still doing their thing. You know, I felt somebody needed to tell this story. I looked around and it just wasn't like a community of writers that were acknowledging what we all knew had just happened. Okay, less than a decade, you know, before, you had stadium-sized venues sold out with these, you know, troops of Black bands, 9, 10, 12 members, with just a big spectacular show going on night after night. And within 5 years, that was a forgotten memory. And I'm like, something's missing. Somebody needs to kind of connect these dots here, because those dots connect to our Black history, our knowledge of ourselves. And if we walk away from that, then we're not going to understand anything else that we're trying to do, because this was the music that came out of Black power. This is the music that came out of a struggle to change the world. And honestly, at this point, I think the sort of artificial shutdown of the funk movement was because of people that were afraid of the power that it had, which brings us to Public Enemy and Fear of a Black Planet, which you can tell that's kind of where we're at right now. Well, that's another story. But so I got started, you know, kind of dabbling in science, always collecting records, obviously. I was a kid in Berkeley, and great record stores out here. And a lot of college towns have record stores because people come and go every year. There's people bring it and they leave. So there's always good turnover. So there was always a good spot to collect. And, you know, dabbled in the science and technology of it. And I said, well, you know, the funk is a way to sort of reach for your interplanetary funksmanship and not really have to lose your soul. And so I understood it and saw myself putting it into play. But then the opportunity availed itself to write about this stuff and kind of capture what the funk is all about. And I had a couple of good advisors over there. I mean, that's a big campus, so I wouldn't say everybody was down for it, but I could find a couple that really understood what I was doing. They understood on a soul level, on a blackness level, on a Black history level, things like that. They understood. They may not have understood, the cosmic slop or the maggot brain, but they could see that it had this heavy gravitas to it, and a lot of them had some James Brown 45s in their collections from back in the day, and they could see that this was sort of expansion out of that big bang that James Brown set this explosion. We're all sort of dealing with this after effects.
Wow, that is so crazy. Very interesting story. And for those who don't know, Cal, very prestige school. If you are an athlete, you got to have the same standards as the regular student body. So they're not going to make any exceptions for you. And of course, the Bay Area, very influential. Black Panthers, Sly and the Family Stone, Graham Central Station, Tower of Power, Sheila E., Tony, Too Short, E40, Club Nouveau, G-Eazy. We could go down the list of all the great acts that came out of the Bay Area. Santana.
Mm-hmm. Breaking them down.
Yes, sir. And also, if you haven't seen the documentary Crip Camp, some of the activists that got the ADA passed in 1990, the seeds were planted in and around the Bay Area because a lot of them went to Cal or stayed in the San Francisco Bay Area. Now, I want to go back to the origins of the funk, to the Midwest, Ohio to be exact, Dayton and Cincinnati. I had Chris Jasper of the Isley Brothers and Jasper Isley on the show recently. He was breaking that down. So in your opinion, what do you think was so important in that particular spot in Ohio with Cincinnati and Dayton that all these great funk acts happen to emerge? And we can't forget Cleveland as well.
And Ohio is just a mind blower because it represents so much of America, and yet it has a very regional history. And part of the great regional history is that that Mason-Dixon line crossed right there. When you get to Cincinnati, you got Kentucky, which is the South, and you cross that line and you are free. You're in the north. You're on your way. You're in the north, and there's this kind of palpable sense of liberation, if you will. And this was after asking a lot of other people that very same question. People started to, kind of take a look at the funk and how did all these bands come out of that same area, all fully formed, all have their own identities, nobody's copying anybody else, all radio airplay worthy, all stage burners, all of them can just play on stage. I mean, what's in the water, right? And that was the phrase for a minute. People said, what is in the water out there that makes all this happen? And there's a couple things. One is the demographics of that region. And when we talk about the Great Migration, that's important because we could talk about just the birth of rhythm and blues and sort of electrified modern music happening after this migration of half of Black America leaving the South and spreading to these larger cities. And then everywhere Black folks go, they create a musical scene of their own. That's what we do, okay? That was the first wave of electrification. In the 1950s, some of these people be in a house for the first time with an electric socket. You can plug your equipment in, you can plug in, you can have a garage band, you can do these things. And so the reason I'm saying that is some communities had a degree of stability, sovereignty. They were able to kind of run their own, I don't want to say run them in some authority way, but they were given their space to do their thing. We've heard about communities, Black communities that were thriving, and there'd be jealousy and tension and violence as a result. But Cincinnati had its own sort of ups and downs, but Dayton in particular, that city managed to thrive with a roughly 50% population, and each kind of took care of its own thing, and didn't, it didn't turn into something against each other. And so that was a place where the Black community could thrive. The Black professional community got along with the people in the illicit economy, let's say. And so the whole sort of Black experience was given a certain element of respect, so people could come up, get some of their style from some folks that are doing unsavory activities, and get some of their technical training from maybe a public school classroom, get their chops up in a battle of the bands with other cats that are doing the same thing, and play with some musicians who had, real equipment, like Junie Morrison, Billy Beck. These folks had state-of-the-art keyboards when they were doing their thing, right? So it was this really interesting mix of class, of sort of community, sort of support, and then creativity. That it just seemed like people saw it as a launch pad, in part for their freedom, because it's across the Mason-Dixon line. Some people give credit to the Wright brothers, because there's a military base that's named after the Wright brothers that people say had some UFO top secret equipment over there, that they stored some things over there. So people always kind of saw that here we are in the middle of the country. Like you said, it's in the Midwest. It's in flyover America, but we have this own sense of being larger than life right here. And so many factors came together to make it happen. And I asked myself that, well, could this have happened in Rochester, New York? Could it have happened in, Atlanta or some other place like that? But somehow Dayton and Cincinnati were, in a sense, at that crossroads. And a lot of times when you're at the crossroads, the crisscrossing connections, that's where creativity happens. Okay. And most of the time, I mean, we have to talk about Dayton now, and Ohio, and Cincinnati. But a lot of times they'll talk about cities where all this other economic and cultural traffic happens, like New Orleans, where there's all this commerce up and down the Mississippi, people coming through, from the Gulf of Mexico, and different, the French were there, and the British were there, and it's near Cuba and all this stuff. And the same with the Bay Area, because there's the mix of that Latino population, the Asian population, the blues people that came out here. A lot of folks that weren't going to take no mess were out there on the West Coast, and we see how that turned into different things. So a lot of times a location where the influences could be different, but they come together in certain creative cultural ways, you can sort of spot something, or at least you can kind of understand something. And so Dayton is the funk capital of the world. Now, you won't hear any argument from that from me. Now, I do know that most of the Dayton members that I've talked to, and I ask them where they get their funk from, they're like, well, of course, we live here with Sugarfoot and Bootsy and the Godfather, but we were studying Sly and the Family Stone, how to put that whole band concept together and take it higher. So he is, in a lot of ways, sort of the lesson, the education that funk around the country needed. So I'm okay with representing the Bay, even though I'm celebrating the funk capital of the world, which is Dayton.
Right, and you can take a look at all of the great acts out of that region: Zap, Ohio Players, Lakeside. We can go on. And you mentioned early hip hop and Zap, and when EPMD put out "You Got to Chill," they were saying how they got a lot of love on the West Coast because not a lot of New York acts were using funk samples. And at that time, when you think of West Coast hip hop, you thought about Egyptian Lover, LA Dream Team, very electro, high energy, what you were here on 1580 K Day. You can check out my interview with Greg Mack, by the way. And in the Bay Area, when E40 and Too Short started breaking in, was there really kind of like saying like, hey, we got our own different style than what's going down in Southern California, and how were they able to carve out their own niche while everybody outside of California only saw West Coast hip hop as coming out of Southern California, Uncle Jam's Army, that whole thing in the early years before Dr. Dre and Death Row.
Yeah, EPMD, that's an interesting way to put it because out here, we got a lot of love for Digital Underground and how they not only brought the hump, they explained the hump. And they didn't just sample funk, they sampled concepts and characters and all this stuff. And they were giving a lot of the West Coast hip hop and everybody else a lesson on how to take that funk sampling thing to another level. But any time you listen to Shock G and those guys, they give it up for EPMD. They recognize that bump that was in there is not just sampling funk, but they sampled the bump, and that means everything. And so when they said boom, 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 relax your mind, let your conscience be free, that really that turned me out. But it would be a year or two later that we heard Digital Underground doing a lot of the same things and referencing EPMD's influence. And then explain this sort of showcasing how much this extra realm of funk there is. When you get down towards the P, it's not just the bump. There's all these other elements that are jazzy and crazy and country and western and spacey and all these different things that if you know what you're doing, you could be sampling P-Funk for the rest of your life and it'll still be original. And so it opened the door to, from my point of view, a much broader way of creating hip hop. What De La Soul with their DJ, I was just playing his work he did.
Prince
Prince
Paul.
Paul, yeah. When he sampled 900 different bits of music for 3 Feet High and Rising. On one level that was brilliant, and on another level it was just sort of opening a doorway to like this is a whole next level of things that can be done. That's historical, it's comical, it's it's as black as you want to be, but it's really, really broad-minded. And so out here, Digital Underground was doing a very similar thing, kind of couching in that pimp strut Bay Area slap that we've had since Larry Graham emerged. But the whole idea was freedom, was this sense of opening things up so you could really be as creative as you want to be. And growing up with the beats, growing up with all the hip hop, there's only so many ways you can say kind of the same street narrative over and over again. And there's sort of an imperative that you bring some style to it, some flavor, some originality, and put your stamp on it. And so, again, much respect to Eric and Parrish making dollars, but the way the thump got sort of established in the hip hop approach in the Bay spread to the G-Funk down south, and then everybody kind of blew up as a result. Ice Cube and those guys, and everybody started to take it up to another level. And now folks are finally unpacking that era for the sort of the quality and the skill level, because folks were still kind of in the glaze of all the scandalous stuff happening as a result. But yeah, man, the funk got some power to it. No way around it.
Yeah, and you mentioned Digital Underground, RIP, Shock G, and how Digital Underground introduced us to Tupac Shakur, who started off as a roadie, dancer, got his cameo on same song for the I Love Trouble soundtrack, and then that led to his career, which tragically was cut short. And Tupac, he had a foot in both worlds where he was for the people and for the streets and was able to meld and mesh the two.
Yeah, I think there's that Netflix documentary on Out the Trunk. That's the hip hop in the Bay, and they talk about how and why Shock G brought in Tupac. Right, there were some other folks in the managers that knew how talented Tupac was, and they knew that he could bring a message, not just be another gangster rapper that gets everybody paid with negativity, but he could bring a message. And in that piece, they said Tupac told Shock G, he said, "Well, I have an offer to be the leader of the New African Panthers in Atlanta. So if unless you want me to do this hip hop, I'm gonna go do that." And that was an interesting kind of crossroads he was at. And Shock G, opened the door to him, and there was folks in support, but he Tupac made a decision to go towards his own craft, his own art, his own revolutionary sensibility, and deliver that to the people as best he could. And for too long, he didn't have that nurturing environment that could have created something even more epic than what he did. But he got it started out here, and it might have been this was the only place it was going to happen because there's so much of a kind of backdrop of revolution out here in the East Bay. Okay, it may not be something you notice, although there's street sign says Huey Newton Way over on 7th Street, and there's murals, and there's echoes of this revolution that was taking place in the Bay Area in particular, in Oakland in particular, Oakland and Berkeley, at a particular time that hasn't left us. And so people recognize that, and people they make space for that. I think because, and this is where I did the research, they recognize the humanity of these folks that were taking on the system. They weren't strung out, drug addicted lunatics loading up guns and doing something stupid. They were very serious, deliberate, careful about being law abiding defenders of their community. Right? And then they built around that so people could contribute in any way that they felt they could. So there was a lot of sort of open space to be who you were in the East Bay, going all the way back, and Tupac kind of sort of represented that in the 90s.
He definitely did. And we touched on earlier Dr. Dre and Death Row, and how when the Chronic came out, it pushed that G-Funk sound nationally, internationally, even by sampling, I believe, was Leon Haywood's I Want to Do Something Freaky to You and Nothing But a G Thing. And for me, as a 7-year-old kid in rural northeastern North Carolina, that was my early view of what life on the West Coast was like through the Chronic and Menace to Society, My Vida Loca, Boys in the Hood, seeing how this is what life on the West Coast was like.
Well, I'm not going to argue with it. It definitely exposed a good amount of life on the West Coast in the post-industrial urban spaces on the West Coast, and that was definitely true. It was definitely there. The only thing that I would sort of add is, and a lot of these kind of films, they just zeroed in very, very narrowly on a community and in a place, in a moment when there is actually a lot more conversation happening. Okay, there's a lot more. Yeah, the young people are doing this stuff, but they still have a conversation with their grandmother in the morning before they get in these. They still connect to things, and I don't know if it matters that much, but I see a lot of street narratives on the East Coast that 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 sort of fill out a whole day in the life of so and so. And the West Coast here, it was pretty easy to glamorize the highlight reel, the drive-by, the craziness. When there's a whole lot of humanity going on here and a lot of diversity going on around here. So it's not simply that binary, but if that was what was needed to kind of break open the conversation, then it definitely served its purpose. And that stuff and those films and those songs are legendary. And it's been a generation, almost two. Let's flush that out. Let's see, how these communities were living and are living now, because it's a bigger picture. It's a bigger pot, because these different people from all over now living in the same region, got the same struggles, same economics, right? Same racist police force, all these different things that are going on. So where are we now? That kind of thing. So I always have that conversation, or I always ask myself about that, because that sometimes you play that hard 90s G-funk and you don't want to play anything else. But it's important to realize that was just sort of, those guys were the front line, and there was all kinds of other things happening.
And back to the funk, mentioned Sly and the Family Stone. Tell me, how was a guy out of Buffalo by the name of Rick James and the Stone City Band, and then another young musician that you all know and love from Minneapolis, Minnesota, took what Sly and the Family Stone did and added their own elements to it. So can you talk about the impact of Rick James, Prince, and how they added to the template that Sly laid?
So what's fascinating about that time period is there were a lot of bands that started up in 69, 70, 71, 72. And then you have this wave of bands that came up later, 77, 78, 79. But a lot of them were all contemporaries because they didn't get known till later. And what Rick James and Prince were both doing in the middle of the 70s, while these other bands are blowing up and building on, the Sly Stone and James Brown formula, those guys were really branching in a lot of other directions. And Prince talks about having to do pop covers, working like for a bar band. And he was underage, and he was still sort of the one arranging the songs. And he said he didn't like it, but he was learning how hits are made, okay, at a young age. Rick James was in a rock band called the Minor Birds in the middle 70s. And he was trying to be, a black rock singer in a white rock band. But what that means is you have this very broad palette of influences that you can bring to your songs. And what was magic about Sly and the Family Stone was Sly had a way of arranging all these different elements in a way that just the groove just fit. It just had a lock tight fit. And so I see and hear James Brown and Rick James and Prince both doing that, taking the little sound elements that they like, or the entire tone that they like, the Prince likes, and making all these broad pieces fit. And I think that's part of their popularity, because the African American experience is African and American, and it's Western as much as it is, primal African groove, rhythm, soul, and passion. So there's structure to it, and there's rawness to it. And the great ones know how to, combine them both really well. And so Rick James, even though we think of his hits, You and I, and Busting Out, and Give It To Me, Baby, if you ever see Rick James show, he'll do a song, and then there'll be like a 40-second interlude of some free jazz in between the tracks, okay? And then he'll do a ballad, and then drop a little blues line for just a couple of bars and come out. And he's just kind of saying, That's all. That's the backdrop to what I'm bringing. And Prince obviously was doing the same thing because he was creating whole songs and whole different new ways, but they were threads of old ways of making hits. And that's what's unique. Well, so many parts that are unique about Prince because he, had his own expressive way of being uncensored and that type of stuff. But musically, he was very bold, but he was just free and audacious about how free he was going to be to add different influences and lock them in. So you can add different influences and it just sounds like clutter. But Sly showed them all how you lock it in and you never lose the groove. So both of them were building on what was a grand tradition, but Jarrell, there was nobody to explain that grand tradition. So the media just said Rick James came out of nowhere, came out of Buffalo. Prince came out of nowhere, came out of Minneapolis, and they're just geniuses, and they just and Michael Jackson, similar story, but at least he's tied into the Motown narrative. Okay, those other guys were sort of treated like they just sort of emerged out of the ether, and part of that, in terms of their skill and their tenacity, is true, but in terms of weaving the threads of Black tradition, what they did was deep in the traditions, as innovative as their music sounded.
And it's crazy how years later Prince ended up getting Sheila E. to come be a part of his band. And we could talk about her family history and how George Duke put her on, and that just led to everything else after that.
Yeah, and not every band is ready for a Latin music master in their band, and so you have to be basically a master in what you do to work with that. And most band leaders are good with personalities as well. And so George Duke was able to do that. Prince was able to do that, and we don't give enough credit to these leaders of people that are also masters of the craft that can do this thing with 6, 7, 8, 9, 12, 15 players, right? Maurice White and Earth, Wind and Fire. Yeah, these people that can, sort of create what is basically a tribe, basically a collective that doesn't have a Western construct. Yeah, a band. Yeah, no, yeah, but no, but yeah, but it's a whole different thing when these Black artists are doing it and they're sort of tapping into that flow. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so that's what people lose track of when it gets all chopped up and sampled and lost, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. And can we talk about how Tony was able to blend funk with R&B? Because I got a funny story for you about Tony. I was a kid, and when I heard Little Walter, and then went to church the next Sunday and heard Wade in the Water, in my 5-year-old mind, I was like, that's Little Walter. And just talk about how Tony was able to merge the funk traditions out of the Bay and mesh that with R&B and have worldwide success. And Raphael Sadiq's solo career as a solo artist, producer, and with Lucy Pearl, which Don Robinson of In Vogue, and Ali Shaheed Muhammad of A Tribe Called Quest.
Wow. What's fascinating to me about Tony, and you nailed it, they knew how to sort of create a pop construction of all these elements of the Bay. And just in thinking about it, I crossed paths a lot with Dwayne Wiggins. And he's one of the Tonys, and he's the bass player, and he lives and breathes Larry Graham. And so any chance you get to talk about, somebody said, Mr. Vincent, we need a conversation about Larry Graham. I would get Dwayne Wiggins up in here to talk about how that affected him, changed his life. Everything he studied, everything he worked on was about Larry Graham. And so that approach to making the music and making it pop accessible comes from that school, the Larry Graham, of course, from the Sly and the Family Stone school, of making all these different influences accessible. But then what's ironic is Tony, for all their songs, they're not known for the big thunder plucking bass. They're known for making all the pieces fit so that Raphael Sadiq's voice can be out front, but he's never alone. There's always something juicy and colorful going on behind it. but they knew the formula at that late 80s period into the 90s for R&B was not about slapping the bass guitar with your thumb and cranking it up. Unless you're listening to the go-go music out of DC, that was not something that the market was interested in trying to work with. They were trying to go the other direction and make a synthesizer do the bass line. And so they had sort of figured out that the bass line is necessary, but we have to tone it and tame it so that it does what needs to be done, so it'll be played basically on the radio. And that's a skill, that's a craft, and not everybody has that. I know a lot of people that are super talented that make, you know, great music of a certain flavor, even a subset of a thing, but I'm not going to ask them to make a radio airplay version of their main record. It's not worth it, because that's not who they are or what their focus is. And you like to think that they've accepted where they are and can give their gifts to people and not worry too much about that. But Tony had it figured out, and they were, I don't know if they were the last, but they were definitely a brilliant link from, you know, the thunderous older days to maybe the real sort of inspired next generation, people like her, folks like that have a consciousness and a creative talent and can work with it.
Right. And also at the same time, Club Nouveau was out and about doing it big with J. King and Foster and McElroy. And if it wasn't for Foster and McElroy, we would not have this little 4-woman group: Cindy, Dawn, Terry, Maxine, better known as In Vogue. And also No Why You Treat Me So Bad, No I Got 5 on It by the Loonies.
And they have the Nation Funktasia. They were trying to do their own funk band for a minute. And they did their own solo record with Godfather.
Dr. Soul.
They had MC Light on that. They had Dr. Soul, right? And so if you listen to that one, they had it figured out. A few of them figured it out. Teddy Riley, few of these people at that time, they figured it out. Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis with Janet Jackson, they figured out how to take that sort of foundation that, you know, sort of is in people's, you know, in their reptilian brain, what they want to groove on, and give it something current and modern, and make it fit and make it work. And you know, I got nothing but respect for Foster and McElroy, who made it happen and managed to stay sort of out of the spotlight. I don't know if that was their goal or not, but they made it unscathed, let's say, because a lot of the folks, you know, the glare of the spotlight will scorch you after a while, and it's rough because people have, you know, they think they have the stamina for it. They think they have the drive and determination for it, but you know, that can shred you in a minute.
Right. The business can chew you up and spit you out. Now, you mentioned Teddy Riley and New Jack Swing. What was your take when you first heard, let's say, Keith Sweat's Make It Last Forever album, or Guy's debut album in '88, and the meshing of hip hop and R&B coming together? And I want to mention that prior to Teddy, Full Force was kind of getting the groundwork started with that, with their work, UTFO, Lisa and the Cult Jam, Cheryl Pepsi Riley.
Houdini. Well, see, the thing is, I sort of witnessed that the most on Soul Train. And when I would hear the New Jack Swing beat, for me, I got a real nose for beats. So if you're gonna play sort of the similar beat on a lot of songs, I'm gonna have my my alerts up. And I said, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? Is this imitation or celebration or what's up? And when I saw how it worked on Soul Train, how people brought those vibes to life, I was like, wait a minute, this is a hook that has some staying power. And right around that time, I got a call from Rhino Records, and they were putting a compilation of New Jack Swing songs together, and they asked me to write the liner notes. And I was like, well, okay, that's where we are. My only issue was they wouldn't let me put the boys, thank you for the funk. And they had a video of that with all the P-Funk elements in there, and it was like a celebration of the history. And New Jack Swing, it's amazing because it had sort of what the electro-funk DJs of the early 80s dreamed of in terms of sort of a mechanized hook that could capture everybody, right? It had that. It had the top shelf singers in the country doing the stuff on top of it. You mentioned In Vogue, we mentioned you got all the Bell Biv DeVoe and all those guys, the whole New Edition, grown up doing that. Ralph Tresvant and everybody else was doing these rub you the wrong way, rub you the right way. Man, I played that on my show the other day. So all of these elements were there, and this was happening during a Black cultural awakening, a Black and proud thing. When people had on their shirt, it's a Black thing, you wouldn't understand, okay? And, let's face it, it's taken about 20 years for white folks to figure out some of those dances that people were doing with New Jack Swing at that time. So it served a powerful purpose. My only issue was, where's the bass? Where's the bass? That was my only concern at the time, but it really delivered in so many ways. It delivered the goods that we were, that we needed. We were thriving at this time through our culture, not through our economics, not through our politics, not through, our relationship to, law enforcement and things like that. But there was a whole lot of sort of cultural activity going on, and the New Jack Swing was sort of our identifying marker. And so you got to be proud of that. And you got to connect all the dots like you've been doing.
Right. And the only other group besides Tony that I felt was able to merge the funk and R&B during the New Jack Swing era was a band out of Buffalo, New York that had a hit with Live and Learn, Joe Public.
Go ahead. Well, that's pretty good. You ran a risk if you were gonna do a groove that wasn't what was in the radio format that the producers were telling you had to do. And Prince was one of the few people that could get away with being off of that formula and still get played, right? And most people were kind of stuck with that conformity thing, and that was a different negotiation. Most of the 80s was that. Most of the 80s was a formula for R&B, which grew into the New Jack Swing formula, and it left people sort of in the lurch if they were going to have an album with 16 songs, but you're kind of told, give us 15 of the same type of thing. When in the past, people would have a regular vinyl album with 8 songs, and you'd have room to really go places with those 8 songs. So the 80s was tougher on some folks, but I got to give it up to the ones that made it through and gave us what we needed.
Right. They gave the people what they wanted. Now let's talk about the early history of Bay Area hip hop. I mentioned earlier E40, Too Short, how they were selling their records out of the trunk and moving units to where the big labels came knocking. But there was this one man out of Oakland that combined the showmanship and presence of James Brown with the emerging styles and sounds of rap, sold his power record independently, made so much noise that Capitol Records came knocking. And then they were well rewarded with Please Hammer Don't Hurt 'Em, selling 10 million plus copies, diamond status. So can we talk about E40, Too Short, and the impact of MC Hammer?
Well, the thing that connects them, although their music is all different, was their hustle and drive and their ability to do them and not do somebody else. Okay. And so Hammer, came up, he was a ball boy for the Oakland A's. He was doing things in the youth, community that, sort of fit his sensibilities and his family background. And he's like, I can be an entertainer. He was already a sort of a youth entertainer. So I can be an entertainer and do this thing, still building on the funk, sampling, tear the roof off, and all this in the sampling the Rick James and whatnot. But he went for it, and it was difficult to watch the critics come after him just for the approach that he was using, which was family-oriented entertainment. What's wrong with that? But there was a bit of a growth process for hip hop to kind of move beyond the street tales and talk about the things at the other side of the street, the things that the other people on the street are dealing with. So Hammer just brought together all of the excitement and the energy and the creativity and some of that boogaloo tradition, all the dance traditions that Oakland has had over the years. And he combined all these things into a kinetic, high energy, sort of entertainment platform that people wish they had today. And it was tough that he got criticized before he just kind of broke through. And surprised Disney didn't sponsor him after a couple of years and keep that going and put him in some kind of Disneyland ride or something, and sort of keep that thing going. Too Short, we know, came through from the neighborhood, making his music for the players on the street. They asked him for beats, and he would make a wrap up with with some of their flavor, give them something, name drop them, and E40 did a similar thing, real grassroots, real homegrown, and his thing was Too Short had a slow, deliberate delivery, and it's funny because the Bay Area's rap scene is really known for some of the fastest deliveries in the game. But Too Short, the originator, was low in the pocket, like a low rider. And that's where he's from. That's what people love from him. And he delivered those goods. And E40 was sort of the clown prince. He could verbalize and exaggerate and contextualize and throw his rhymes out there with so much flavor, and yet so much authenticity, people couldn't get enough of it. But they were all established before a major label came after them. It's not like some big industry showed up and said, okay, here's your star that you have to support. They all came up that through their own ranks on their own terms and gave people these multiple flavors. The same way, Paris, and we already talked about Digital Underground, they came up on their own terms. Boots Riley and the Coup talking about revolution and still being funny, entertaining, and having their own spicy flavor, right? And it appears, I asked Boots Riley that, I mean, how did you get a record deal? You wasn't gonna go beg a record company. And he said, some record company hack walked into Leopold's Records, which is one of the main big indie record stores in the 80s. And back then, there's someone at the door that's DJing at the door. And they're like, take your bag, and they're spinning records and da da da. And that guy walked in and said, who's hitting right now? And the guy just handed him the Coup. And boom, because there was so much interest in what was happening, they got sold. But nobody was going to tell Boots Riley what to say or what to do. And I don't know if a conversation was had among those, industry representatives, but it wasn't very much of a big debate. The folks that came out of here were all different, and they were all original. You either want to roll with them, or go somewhere else and get some conformity, because you're not going to find it here.
Right. And if it wasn't for Hammer, E40, Too Short, there'll be no Souls of Mischief, Hieroglyphics, Del the Funky Homo Sapien, Mr. Fabe, Mac Dre, RIP, G Easy, and all of the great traditions that came out of the Bay Area. Now with Hammer, Pray samples When Doves Cry by Prince. And I read that Pray was one of the rare samples that Prince cleared.
That's a interesting situation because most of us figured that it was just an automatic no, that they don't even listen, and you don't get it. Um, so that, that kind of means a lot when you unpack the whole thing, because it could, make or break someone's career. Hammer still would have been, celebrated, but that kind of means something. And it's interesting when you get down into, that inner sanctum of where these great artists are, and they have, values and principles and morals, and they really want to find a way to, do something helpful. It's just usually difficult for them to get through all the layers and screens and actually deal with folks. It took a while, I think, for Prince's aura to kind of fade a little so the real person could come out and be seen.
Right, because I know Speech had said in an interview when Tennessee broke, they didn't get a sample cleared for Alphabet Street for Tennessee, and how Prince heard it, and then later found out the song's true meaning and everything. And Speech said he cut us a break, charged us only a flat fee, where he could have just said cease and desist, take the record off like Gilbert O'Sullivan did with Biz Markie and I Needed a Haircut, where he illegally sampled Alone Again naturally.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's too bad that the conversation isn't a little more systematically uh, you know, connected, and that support could be built upon. For what it's worth, the sampling that did happen did show the sort of historical connection to the roots of the music. And I don't know if those approvals were based on any of that at the time, but it did help give a generation a sense that, we're a part of something new and now that is riding on something that was happening then, for the same reasons and in the same way, and we're on the dance floor enjoying it the same way, and
Right.
that's a beautiful thing.
Right. And I want to go back to early hip hop and how a lot of like Sugar Hill Gang, a lot of Houdini productions done by the late great Larry Smith, they sounded like funk records. And was it because early rap was still in the disco era going into boogie, which was later coined by acts like D Train, Kashif, so on and so forth. So you kind of had that funk taste in early rap.
Well, a lot of the first rappers and rap recordings and rap, I don't want to call them tours, but gigs were piggybacking on what the funk and R&B operation already had in place. So if you were gonna, get anywhere out of the New York City area, you might have to uh, go on the road, opening for Sky or Shalimar or somebody like that. You would be maybe in between two big hit R&B funk bands and have your little set that sort of is for the teenagers at that time. And then the promoters realized these kids got a more excited fan base than our grown folks R&B bands on the road. And a lot of the recordings that the rappers were doing, they're the machinery for making the electronic sounds wasn't necessarily what they needed. And a lot of them had to record, I don't know if they had to or they felt honored to, but they had funk bands in the studio with them, backing them up with the music. And the most prominent is Curtis Blow's The Breaks. These are the breaks. And he basically had impromptu go-go band playing that backup for him. And he was talking about the breaks in your life, but he's also talking about the breaks in this breakdown right here, right? And so there was a fascinating relationship between the R&B funk um, industry and how it sort of was the bassinet, if you will, for hip hop to be able to stand on its own feet, because it had to be nurtured somewhere. So it was nurtured in the same studios where the R&B and funk was nurtured. Even um, Sylvia Robinson, who created the Sugar Hill Gang, right? She had this whole legacy of making R&B hits herself and for others, and so you had an infrastructure there. Even Dr. Dre made his hits at Solar Records, right, which is for R&B bands, for R&B acts. So they sort of built on this infrastructure that was in place, and so it was maybe more than just sampling, or the sampling came about as a result of that relationship. But it was a strong one then if you knew what you were looking for. An outsider would just sort of not care or notice it sounds like the other one, or oh, they stole that. And sometimes it was just more they loved that and they giving them some love. So the beginning of hip hop couldn't have happened if the R&B funk industry wasn't sitting right there.
Right. And you mentioned Solar Records. I want to talk about a young man out of Indianapolis, Indiana. He got with a little band called The Deal, along with his future songwriting producing partner, Antonio L.A. Reid, doing funk. If you go back and listen to the Material Things album, Street Beat, Body Talk, Just My Luck. And then later on, that started LaFace, everything that came out of LaFace, his solo everything. And can we just talk about the impact of Babyface?
Man, Babyface, who got his name from Bootsy Collins. Uh, he had, and it's funny because most of his brilliance was behind the scenes, even though his name is Look at Me. But him and L.A. Reid, these guys were a generation ahead of Jay-Z. They were a generation ahead of these rap moguls in the East Coast that we valorize. And some people actually valorize their music. And that's cool. But to kind of move forward in the industry, in front and in back at the same time, and do it in a way that was so slick, people didn't even know you were taking things over. And that's what I always appreciated about them. It's like, ooh, I got another. And they weren't out front making themselves so vulnerable that they could just be taken out. They always sort of had something built. I do wish Babyface would record some more music. Again, it's not, to me, it's never too late. But the industry wouldn't pick it up. But we have a new industry now, and that's our own community that can follow these stars and give them support and things like that. And I think folks like him not only could put out music, he could put out some seminars on how to operate within the music industry and thrive.
Right. And Babyface, Babyface, he just released actually his demo of Rock Steady before it got cut on the Whispers. And I want to talk about another person in Solar that gets mentioned by true music heads, but not a lot of folks in the mainstream know. The baddest man, producer, arranger, comes from a family group down in Southern California, out around the same time of the Jackson 5, gave you cuts such as Boogie Fever, Hotline, Forever Yours. You know who I'm talking about. Talk about Mr. Leon Silvers.
Man, he's another one of those movers and shakers that you wouldn't notice, except you notice his big old afro when he was fronting those the Silvers band. He just had a special knack for making something happen, and like I said, then letting it happen by itself. And I always respected what he did, why he did it, and how he did it. And he kind of put a stamp on a kind of a West Coast R&B thing that, when you start to unpack it, there was a lot of creativity coming out of there. And I think I looked at it as like, this is really good. Is it really good, or just does Don Cornelius always give him all the play for every record that he does? And I always thought about that because if I was in LA, I would have been all up in Solar Records. I've been in the lobby just hanging out, checking these people out, learning how they operate and how they seem to do it so well and sort of, like I said, stay out of that burning spotlight. Okay. The only time I thought it got out of hand was when Jody Watley went solo. And she said, I'm going to step forward, or maybe somebody told her, and then the burning spotlight hit. And she had, one great year, maybe two, and it just seemed like, I don't want to say she wasn't the same after that, but that burning spotlight, will dry people up. And it's not like she came back 2 years later with, something with more fire than she had with, I'm looking for a new love, and that whole album that she did. It just seemed like everybody Leon Silvers knew how to keep it going and not get burned and stay out of that spotlight. And he's one of the greats. I need to do a whole tribute to his music.
Right, and the Misdemeanor record that he cut on his younger brother Foster, the sample for Ain't It Funky Enough by the DOC, one of the best West Coast rappers I've ever heard. No one can do it better. My top 5 rap albums of all time. And also Dynasty, Adventures in the Land of Music, sampled by Campolo for Lucchini, which was produced by my fellow NC native Ski Beats. And we talked about LA and Babyface, but I want to talk about Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, their production, how they were able to have that funky stuff along with the pop sensibility, the way you still have the funk, but you were able to do it just enough to get it play on pop and R&B radio. They had that same knack and skill, like you mentioned, that Teddy Riley, LA, and Babyface had, where you're able to make it raw and authentic while the masses are loving it at the same time.
Yeah, I felt what they did with Janet Jackson, right at the time that they did it. I don't know how old you were when it first dropped, when Miss Jackson, If You're Nasty, and those.
Control. You're going to be shocked when I tell you how old I was when Control came out. I was about 1, because Control came out in 86.
Okay. But it was really the first to take the big electro funk zap slapping beat claps and make R&B make radio R&B accept it. Okay, so they were taking it was really the ground level street sound and putting it in these songs, and they had these softer melodies. I keep thinking of the piano on Love Can Never Do Without You, and the little softer melodies with the big beats. And it created, and Janet's voice doesn't get credit because, she's not Patti LaBelle, she's not a belter. No, but she's a part of that atmosphere that music made, that had this top that was so pop, and yet it had this bottom that had what was really the current electronic funk slap beats on the bottom. And so I love what they did to kind of usher in a kind of new way of making pop club music. That, to me, it gave an homage to what the beat experimenters were doing. A lot of times I talk about the 80s, and we can mention the pop songs, but in generations before, improvisation and jazz was the saxophone, and rock was Jimi Hendrix and the guitar, and maybe the synthesizer, Billy Preston, Stevie Wonder, and Bernie Worrell, and some of that. But in the 80s, it was really people experimenting with the beat, with the dub sounds, with the swamp, and there's a lot of reggae music that was coming through that was opening people's nose, and they were listening to how these kind of industrial funk noises were coming through on a like I said, an underground level, but then what made it to the top was Janet Jackson, was all the other club people, all other people we would deal, and all these folks what we're talking about. Full force, turn the beats up a little bit stronger than anybody else, right? And they were doing that because that was what was happening below them, right? And so they brought the beat up there with them. And so I was cool with that, and that in a sense made more room when the big hardcore hip hop from Public Enemy and Flavor Flav talking about bring that beat back. And so it was all about the beat back then.
Mm-hmm. And I want to mention out of Michigan, Flint, Ready for the World, and Oak Park, Dream Boy. They were signed to Quest Records, which was Quincy Jones' record label. Very, very successful act. If you know, in the Midwest, Dream Boy got played a lot, but I think what got Ready for the World more push was that they had the co-sign of the electrifying Mojo out of WJLB out in Detroit. And if you know Detroit Midwest radio, Electrifying Mojo was the man.
That guy was nuts, and for him to give credit to a band that may not have something extreme happening, but they kind of did. Those guys had a certain flavor to them, and so you're right. By getting that guy to support, to endorse them, that took them maybe to a next step. And that's the thing. Our whole community supported our stuff back then, and I don't know if a young electrifying Mojo could show up today. He might have a good internet blog, but the connections that he had and the way he could sort of recreate our culture in ways that is just big, and you're thinking more than you plan to think that day when you sort of get walloped by his stuff. But he's wild. I wish I had listened to him growing up.
Right.
That would have been something.
I do too. And I want to know, is there a difference between funk out of the Bay Area, funk out of the Midwest, and funk out of other locations with acts such as Cameo, SOS Band, Fatback Band, BB&Q Band? Are they all the same but with different variations depending on regionality?
Well, there are a few kind of regional tweaks that you can find. The New Orleans funk has just a little bit of a lowdown to it, so you're not going to find that super high energy stuff, and it got a little bit of just a little tinge of that blues roots that's in there, that down in the swamp type of funk, and it has its own self-contained culture. There are people that are extremely popular in New Orleans funk, New Orleans music. They may not even be known far outside. They'd be known around the world maybe better than they're known in Michigan or something like that, in Iowa or something like that. I would imagine they know, but it has its own identity. Minneapolis has its own identity. New York had an identity that I always associated with the BT Express because they had grit, but then they had a certain soul singing on top and an ability to arrange songs. Even before Kashif was involved, they were arranging some really good stuff. And there was a guy, I think his name is Randy Muller, who wound up going from that to Brass Construction and then Sky. And all of those kind of had a slick, soulful clubbiness to them. And it's like every funk band out of New York sort of was in the inner planets of disco at that time. So they all kind of worked with it. The Fatback Band, through the Spanish Hustle, Jimmy Castor did a few, even though he always cranked up the bass when he was doing his thing. Cameo did Find My Way, and they also kind of mixed both with It's Serious. They were doing, disco funk as best you can say. And so that was sort of the big center of gravity for a lot of these bands that were funk bands, that when they got the opportunity to cut loose, they would, throw down, because the great funk was there. James Brown was there a lot. P-Funk was there a lot. So people got it, but it was just this other influence. But so I think of New York funk as a sort of disco influence, sort of brilliant combination of sort of disco influence, dance music, and sort of the organic funk licks that these other people had. Now there's a West Coast thing that is, it sort of has it's hard to find a direct line, but it's these echoes of Sly and the Family Stone and Grand Central Station. And you can find it in bands out of Seattle. You can find it in a lot of LA bands that come up. And of course, in the Bay, there's a guy named Ron Cat who left P-Funk after 10 years and did his band, the Catdelic, and they, the last couple of years, are winning the best band in the Bay awards, and that's across all styles. But he was bringing that P-Funk vibe, real strong, real heavy. And I always felt that the Bay Area funk sound, it had all these original elements, but there was the Tower of Power thing always lets you know there's a big band element to funk. That may not be your thing, but there is a big band element to funk. And so there are bands out of New York like Lettuce, and some of these new ones like Turquoise, and some of that stuff Dane Funk is producing out of LA. And people are trying their hand at different formulas of that funk. And we're kind of spoiled out here because we've seen a lot of these flavors, and sometimes, I don't know if that's true or not, we kind of like measure them by some of these other higher standards, which isn't really right. You should measure them by 2021.
Right. And you mentioned Dane Funk. When I first heard, I want to thank you for stepping into my life off of Teach His Own, I immediately thought of Surface. It has that
And
Surface sound.
you could tell he's been thinking about that, okay? And he wants to recreate that for a new generation. And I think he's doing that. Sometimes I think he needs to find himself, a superstar singer to be in front of some of these arrangements that he does, that can bring a lot of that to life. And he would kind of open the door, because he's created a career for himself beyond just being a DJ, right? And so in that sense, he's kind of that pioneer. And I'm sure there are plenty of other folks that started as DJs that became, producers and and yeah, you got house music and techno, and you got these people that did it. But to be able to do it with the funk and with the kind of high standards of R&B that are there, he's been doing some heavy lifting. So I do, I like to hope that he's still got his wheels spinning, and maybe he spent this downtime in the lockdown kind of putting some collaborations together that
Right.
can kind of let everybody know that he's the OG, and that mix should be happening. And he's one of the front line people that can do that.
And where is it that you think that Bruno Mars found that sweet spot where he's able to take 70s soul, 80s funk, R&B, reintroduce it to a new audience? Because when I heard Leave the Door Open with him and Anderson .Paak, 70s soul, Uptown Funk, Morris Day and the Time, Finesse, New Jack Swing, he's able to take music of the yesteryear and recycle it, not recycle, I would want to say reintroduce it in a way to where it is not considered, oh, that's your mom, dad's, aunt, or uncle's genre. But young kids are saying, hey, I want more of this. And they go back and listen to records from before, just like I did with the previous decade's records when I was their age.
Yeah, and it's not a crime to do that. I personally think every artist that gets a record deal, they come in with a dozen songs of their own, and somebody says, no, we don't need that song that gives credit to Billie Holiday. No, we don't need that song about your grandmother. No, we don't need that song about the blues that you came up with. Give us the 8 trendy hits and then we will write the rest of them and give you a record. And I think there's a filtering. I think people have this stronger connection to their roots. We all have it, but the commercial industry, it's not their first idea to recognize that, to celebrate that. And so the artist has to oftentimes push really hard, or a crisis like George Floyd's murder in cold blood on in broad daylight. Something has to happen for sort of disruption of the boundaries and the gatekeeping to happen, so people can start to do that a little bit more. And I wish they would. It shouldn't have to take, a crisis like the Vietnam War and the black civil rights and Martin Luther King's murder. Shouldn't have to take that much for freedom of the artist to take hold. But unfortunately, that's been our history.
Right. And two more questions. I'm going to get you out of here on those two. Your thoughts on the impact that Soul Beat has had on the Bay Area. And for those of you that don't know Soul Beat, Chuck Johnson came out in, I believe, 79, predated BET by a year. And also what Boots Riley, David Diggs, and Ryan Coogler are doing in the entertainment film space, and how they're carrying on the traditions of all the greats from the Bay Area that came before them.
Yeah, well, Chuck Johnson Soul Beat created our own kind of conversation network. Like Don Cornelius went national, Chuck Johnson was regional, and we felt it. And again, people came out here to sort of work with him. He didn't try to work. I mean, he did. He worked with everybody. But I remember Lakeside did a video of one of their songs that was just an Oakland version, because they came out and they wanted to, rock Soul Beat in a way that respected that. And that says a lot about Lakeside. It says a lot about Soul Beat and Chuck Johnson, and a lot about Oakland. That folks would want to connect to what we were doing. And it's hard because I didn't know that every other city didn't have its own Soul Beat. Okay, I knew it had a local feel, and I knew that there were folks that could get on and do their own, kind of programming and stuff. But I thought, just kind of maybe absently, that every Black city would have some of that, and maybe it did, and it disappeared. But that was a part of what helped define who we are, what we're about. And so then you have this next wave of youngsters come up, and you mentioned that David Diggs and Boots Riley, who's now a filmmaker, and Ryan Coogler, and a handful of others. The subject matter that they're using, the historical consciousness, the sort of echoes of the Black Panthers, that Black power and Black pride that's around. The tone of a lot of those films is where I wish our music would be. Okay, and you have to really look hard to find good examples of that music. Like I said, they made it through the gatekeepers. They can do that. Now, she can do that, but she was already a child star, and sort of had worked on her path, had been able to work on that path. So she couldn't just be dismissed right away, right? And if she were by someone else would remember and plug her in. But for a minute, I was like, well, Black film is doing what Black music used to do, especially Black film from Oakland. It's telling our story in a raw, rich, real way that can empower us, to stand up against this storm and to, create images and ideas so that we can handle this mess. Okay, and it would be nice. Now, maybe one of the next movies will have a real heavy Oakland soundtrack type of thing. There's a few cuts, and that's cool. But I'd like to see Oakland get, really recognized as this, to use a term out here, impact hub. That's not a term, that's a location for community work that's done. But people should be able to see that Oakland is where these ideas come from, and this is where, these liberated thinking, these liberated people with multiple influences, but liberating Black lives is front and center.
Right. And if you have not seen Blind Spot, and sorry not to bother you, great films, check them out and get fed for your mind, your spirit, your soul. Now, Dr. Vincent, any shout outs you want to give before we conclude this interview, and also plug your social media and also current
Well,
projects?
I'm on the air every Friday night doing a kind of psychedelic Juneteenth this Friday on the history of funk. You can go to RickeyVincent.com and see what those things are about. I'm on Facebook, and I have a list of the history of funk with Rickey Vincent on KPFA, where we kind of keep the information of that kind of thing going and keep it bouncing around. A lot of us are just now peeking out like groundhog, just looking at what's up now that the opening is and there's bands playing again, and how do we do this? How do we do this thing? And I'm still doing the radio outside. I'm remotely sending them those things. So I'm looking forward to the time we can all get together and jam and have a session in the studio and do our thing together. But that's what I'm doing. I'm still collecting, still writing. I got some projects on the line. Russian publisher translated the funk book into Russian this year, and they asked me for a new chapter. And since nobody else had asked me for a new chapter, they have a new introduction, and I'm working on a new chapter for the funk book, which it might be a minute before it comes out in English, but that's happening. And then some people that work with Brother Scott Brown at UCLA, he helped organize the Dayton Funk Symposium in 2018. And that was awesome. A lot of musicians came, some scholars came, and people came. And they're doing another one in the fall of 2021 in November. And so people are going to be coming, and they're talking about, research on the music, and some musicians talking about the music, and they have concerts and things. So people are trying to put down roots for the funk, and there's nothing better to do than that. After 50 years, we need to recognize everybody's work and give them some solid legacies that they can give to their children and beyond.
Right, because you don't want them to grow up like Sir Nose, devoid of funk, and be just that, devoid of the funk, because the funk is good, the funk is gritty, the funk is nasty. Funk is funk. Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank Dr. Rickey Vincent for his time, for coming on to Beyond the Album Cover. You can catch this interview wherever you stream podcasts, on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/J85, and on the website, beyondthealbumcover.wordpress.com. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, Dr. Rickey Vincent on Beyond the Album Cover. Dr. Vincent, thank you for doing this interview.
Thank you, Brother Gerald. Appreciate all of it, man. Stay
No
strong.
problem. No problem.